Welcome to the show today. Today's guest is John Kirkland. John Kirkland is the CEO of ICL and is a shipping executive dealing with shipping worldwide. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, John.
John, maybe we could start off by getting, for our viewers, a little bit of an overview of the shipping industry in general. Where are the largest ports in the world? Maybe to mention that, also to possibly talk about the size of the GDP that is going through shipping lines. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
John, every day around the world, thousands of containers are being discharged in ports around the world. The big focus over the last 5-7 years, a tremendous shift has been into Asia, and specifically China, as China has seemed to become the factory for the world, and a lot of sourcing has been outsourced to China for manufacturing. So the largest ports today are very much in China, ports like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Shenzhen. And then we moved down into Singapore, which was traditionally the largest port in the world, and it's fallen down the ranking a little bit with the growth in China. And then we start to move into the Middle East with Dubai being a very large port. And then into the west coast of the United States, into the Oakland and Long Beach area of the west coast. And then there's pretty much a lot of ports all around the same amount of throughput.
It seems like things are changing very quickly, especially with the growth in Asia.
Absolutely.
John, what is your background? You obviously are with ICL. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into that industry?
John, I left school in Liverpool. Liverpool was a big port at that time, and shipping was in the blood of the city. And I got a job with a company called Sealand at that time. And Sealand were actually the innovators of containerization back in 1956. And I started working for them in the UK and moved to the continental Europe to Holland, and then moved to the United States with them and got a real good look at trade and the growth of the container trade at that time. It was a very new industry, exciting times, pioneering times, and a sign of the times is that Sealand, that were the number one containerized company in the world, were taken over by Maersk Line, and who Maersk are the current number one liner shipping company in the world. So it's been an interesting journey.
I've heard the figure that 90% of world trade is actually going through shipping. And you mentioned to me earlier that about 50% of that is in container shipping. And that's really what your company focuses on.
Exactly. Just a little over 54% of world trade today is with the liner companies, more than $400 billion of value.
Wow.
Our trade does not get the publicity in the supply chain and supplying all of the things that we take for granted every day. And there's more and more publicity about our industry and the key that it plays in world trade today.
What makes a good port?
Well, a good port certainly has to be close to people or to manufacturing. So that's the first thing. It's either got to be a port that is close to the sourcing of the cargo, or it has to be close to the end user of the cargo, people. If you think about some of the names that I just mentioned, there's Shanghai, Long Beach, Oakland, big population centers. Here in Europe, Antwerp is a big port that we sit here today in Belgium. Rotterdam is a big port. Hamburg, Bremerhaven, Felixstowe, Southampton, Liverpool for the UK. So close to people, close to manufacturing, good access from the sea as these vessels get larger and larger.
And not only the access to the sea, but once the products arrive in the port or whatever, I guess also there are some other factors. For example, whether it goes by rail, whether it goes by truck, whether by barge.
Port infrastructure is very, very important. Our business wants to have quick turn times with our vessels. So we want to arrive and sail as quickly as we can. So waiting for a berth is no good. So a port has to have enough quays, infrastructure to handle peaks and valleys.
Right.
But I mentioned to you earlier that the delivering cargo to the customer or picking up cargo from the customer is a huge part of our business today. It varies a little bit by trade, but in my trade, in the transatlantic trade, we actually spend more money on purchasing inland transportation than we pay for our vessels, our fuel.
That's a surprise to me. That's really something. So then, if you're looking in Europe, you're basically doing transatlantic. So if we're looking at Europe, what are the major ports in Europe?
Major ports in Europe, Rotterdam leads the way in my industry. Antwerp and Hamburg kind of vie for second and third, depending on what's happening. Bremerhaven is a very large port. Le Havre is a huge port. And then, as mentioned before, in the UK, Southampton, Felixstowe, Liverpool. And then going down into the Mediterranean, we've got Valencia, Barcelona, Algeciras, Leghorn, Livorno.
John, your company is really dealing in some of the European ports such as Antwerp, Liverpool, and also on the East Coast in Richmond, and also Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and North Carolina. Let's just take Antwerp, since we're located here today. What makes Antwerp a good port?
Well, Antwerp has traditionally been a port throughout its history.
Going back to the 12th century.
Going back to the 12th century. Trading has always been a big part of Antwerp, of Antwerp's history. And the port has really been at the forefront technically and offering very, very good services and being able to be the closest port to most of the population in Europe. If you look at Antwerp's location versus Rotterdam, it is the closer location to most large either consumers or industries here. It's closer to the Ruhr, for example. The Ruhr is, of course, the largest manufacturing center for Germany. It's the closest port to the Ruhr, closer than the North German port, closer than Rotterdam to the Ruhr. So its role is geographic. It has a tremendous geographic advantage. You do have to sail up a river to get here, which is a little bit of a disadvantage for our industry. But if you weigh the two things together,
all in all,
and the port has great flexibility. The labor is extremely professional here, and it works very well.
Good. Concerning the GDP, if you look at world GDP over the last 4 years, starting really in 2009, was really a very difficult year for the world. How did that affect the shipping industry, and how did that develop from 2009 up till now? And then what is the outlook for the future?
Well, we entered a little bit of a perfect storm, unfortunately, in 2009, because as the financial crisis triggered an economic crisis, and imports and exports slowed considerably around the world, our industry had been ordering large vessels, many large vessels, what we call ultra-container vessels, ULCs, and we had this terrible supply and demand scenario where at the time when we were, as an industry, putting new ships, larger ships into the industry or into the trade, demand was falling off the cliff as everyone adjusted to the new financial crisis that started. So 2009 was difficult. Our industry laid vessels up. We scrapped a lot of older vessels, inefficient vessels. And 2010, as the recovery started, we were in a better position. So we had a little bit of a bust in 2009. We came back in 2010 with quite a good year as we managed to balance supply and demand.
Surprisingly, so quickly, within 1 year, that turned around.
Well, it's really about managing the supply and putting the ships in the ocean to carry the cargo that's available and not sailing or trying to sail empty ships.
In 2011 and into
2011, we were expecting, again, growth. Unfortunately, when we order vessels, we're ordering vessels 3-4 years in advance. So you can nobody ever could see when we were ordering vessels that we'd have this financial crisis, this economic crisis. So consistently, we were bringing in larger and newer vessels each year. We can't halt the production line of these vessels because once they start building, you can delay a little. But really, your only option is to take vessels and tie them up effectively and put them into storage until better times return.
So then what right now is the supply situation with world shipping in general?
We're still heavily weighted in the supply. Various things have been used in our industry. We are adding ships to strings. So optimally, you could run 9 ships, for instance, between Northern Europe and Asia, which is the second largest market in the world. Now we see strings with 11 or 12 ships on there. So as these ships are coming out, they're going into existing strings and loops of vessels. And all vessels are being slowed down, which is having an effect to reduce the cost, the fuel cost for the liner shipping companies, and B, better environmentally because our emissions steaming at a slower speed are less than, of course, steaming at a higher speed.
And that really gets into the trends in the industry that I wanted to talk about. And I guess we've heard and seen on the news very large container ships, bigger and bigger all the time. Is that the continuing trend?
It is. The largest container ships today are about 14,000 20-foot equivalents. To put that into some kind of context for your listeners, it would be a train about 100 miles long if we were to put all of those 40-foot containers end to end.
Wow.
So these ships are huge.
And they're still getting bigger and bigger?
Still getting bigger. There are ships being built by Maersk Line right now, which will have a capacity of 18,000 TEUs. These are about as big as I can see happening, and these ships don't have really the versatility to go to a lot of trades. They can do Asia-Europe. For example, they couldn't do Asia-US because the ports on the West Coast couldn't handle that kind of size.
Will that change over time? I would imagine the U.S. would react over time to that and invest in deeper harbors.
There is a tremendous push going on in the U.S. right now, and the president has just signed various initiatives for ports to be dredged up and down the East Coast, as well as the West Coast. A lot of this has to do with the Panama Canal widening. This is another huge...
Which will be done in...
2015 is the date, and that will...
All of these large container ships now will be able to pass through.
Most of them will be able. I'm not sure about the 18,000s, but certainly the 14,000 TEU ships will be able to transit through. So there's all kinds of initiatives going on around the U.S. because the Panama Canal was the restriction. For most of these vessels.
As far as trends, you've mentioned really how important fuel is in that, and I would imagine in the future that's going to continue to be very important, and that perhaps the ships that are being produced now are running, or their engines are more efficient. Can you comment on that?
I think you would probably could say that the efficiency of the engines now are probably 10 to 15% better than they were 5 years ago. We're trying as an industry very hard to reduce the emissions from our vessels. We're still, as an industry, the most efficient way of moving freight is still on a vessel.
Now, as far as the use of fuel, I would imagine it's affected also by speed. So do you also determine the speed of your lines and the relationship to cost?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned before about adding vessels to your fleet to slow them down. Most companies in our industry, we have 400 weekly sailings around the world today. That's a liner industry. So a customer knows that this shipping line is sailing weekly. His arrival date could be 2 weeks later in our trade in the Atlantic. It could be 3 weeks later in the Far East trade. So he is going to consume fuel to make that scheduled date on his for his arrival in the country that he's headed to or the port he's headed to. And lots of factors can happen in that. Weather is the critical one. You can have very difficult winters in the North Atlantic. So we have a very different schedule in the North Atlantic in the winter than we do in the summer in terms of how much fuel we must burn.
Some years ago, there had already been shipping orders in for larger craft or whatever, and you can delay it a little bit, but they are being delivered over the last years or whatever. But at some point, I would imagine there must have been a reduction in orders.
Absolutely.
And has that had an impact on the shipping industry as far as the building?
It has. I would say towards the second half of 2011, we saw less orders. 2012, there have been very few orders. The shipping building industry, normally container ships would have been built in places like Germany, Japan, Korea in the past. China, once again, has gotten into shipbuilding and container shipbuilding in a large way. It's interesting now, the prices for new container ships have never been lower because of the competition between the yards. But still, orders are very slow coming. For another reason too, finance being available. The banks are very reluctant today to loan money into the shipping industry. We have a lot of distressed vessels out there for sale today where banks have had to go and arrest the vessel and bring it back into their portfolio. So banking and finance, normally you could maybe finance 90% of a vessel in the past, sometimes 95% when money was very easy. Now you'd be lucky 70%. So you have to come up with about 30% of the cost price of a vessel right now. An ultra large container vessel, we talk about 14,000 TEUs, is about 110 million.
Okay. Wow.
So if you relate that you need around 10 or 11 for a loop between Europe and the Far East, that's a tremendous, much more than $1 billion in investment. That's a huge investment for a company to take on right now.
And that's unlikely to change in the near future.
I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
I think, but I think what's most important is that world trade shouldn't worry. We have enough capacity, because the vessels coming out are large, much larger than the vessels are replacing.
You're talking about supply and demand. I remember I was on the East Coast running a company, and we needed to have shipping. I think it was back in 2008 or whatever. And what I could not understand is when on the East Coast shipping to Europe, we couldn't get containers. How does something like that happen?
Well, there's a finite number of containers out there. That's the first thing.
Secondly, it seems like they all ended up on one side of the world, or maybe even in China, perhaps.
It happens. And carriers sometimes, we can find ourselves in the situation. If your manufacturing facility is close to the port, you can usually find containers. The further inland you become, so let's take a Midwestern point of Chicago, the harder it can be, because carriers have to make the decision, okay, do I go back with this empty to China to pick up the next high-paying consumer import, or do I go out to the Midwest to pick up a low-value, possibly low-rated commodity, and then that container by the time it's empty for the next load, we could be talking 40 days.
Right. So you never know. There are always, like any industry, I guess, peaks in supply.
You never know. And as our industry, if like in 2009, we have a very difficult year, one of the last things you're going to spend your money on is building new containers.
Right. Okay. Speaking of the future and the outlook, how do you see the outlook? I mean, right now, if you look in Europe, it's a little bit pessimistic. If you look at the economies of Spain, obviously Italy, Greece, France, UK also is really right about even growth. US is not significant growth. It's not in a recession in any case. How do you see the next year or two?
Very much how you explained it there. We see very little growth in what we would call the mature economies, that being Western Europe, Southern Europe, and the United States. Whilst there is a slowdown in Asia because of what's happening in their partners trades like the United States and Europe, we still see growth over there of around 6%. So our industry sees growth. Where the ships are being designated to go, deployed, is where the growth is.
Right. But as far as transatlantic, the growth is not significant over the next couple of years, which brings me to the earlier comment you made about where orders for ships have been brought on and they're still being delivered. So if growth is not that significant, presumably you still have supply coming on of ships, not necessarily your company, but just the industry in general.
Yes.
And I would imagine, like you said, you're slowing down boats, adding more ships into the thing in order to
in order to take. Obviously, there's new markets developing all the time. Intra-Asia is a huge trade for our vessels, and not really restricted on size.
So the growth in China means that they could be actually buying vessels that were bought by some companies doing transatlantic trade, or
no, I don't see that. What I see, John, is that trades are growing in non-traditional areas. If we look at the key eastbound, westbound trades, transatlantic, Europe, Far East, Europe, USA, Far East, USA. Huge trades today is, for example, Asia to the Middle East, Asia to Africa, Asia to South America, South America to Asia. So there are many places now for ships to go because of these markets growing and growing. So I think because we're not going to be building in 2013, 14 right now, I think we'll see supply and demand coming back together.
Environmentalists for the last, I don't know how many years, have been putting an argument forward saying that really the shipping of product from so many far locations to another is in some cases unnecessary. They're also promoting basically the production locally as well as the consumption locally. Is that a subject that is being discussed? And if so, how does the shipping industry counter?
It's certainly being discussed. Protecting the environment for our industry is extremely important. And we have a very safe and secure industry when it comes to doing these things. And we have an awful lot of time spent on the environment. Can engines be more efficient? Yes. We talked a little about vessels getting larger. So if you look at the footprint of one container.
Well, I think you had mentioned before that from a cost point of view, it's still the cheapest method of transporting. So I don't think it really gets into that. It's clearly the costs are coming down, I think, in the long run, especially with more fuel-efficient machines and so forth. But I think the argument that they put forward is just more for local production as much as possible. I don't know whether that's realistic or not, but at least that's the argument that they're putting forward. Do you see that really having any impact on shipping in the future?
John, it could do. I mean, we do hear of insourcing. We talked about the word outsourcing, where manufacturing from Europe and the US went to China. We are seeing some of that coming back into the United States right now. I think a lot has to do with the unemployment rates in the United States, the competitiveness, the competitive reality of the United States right now, salary inflation in China, which is starting to happen. And then, of course, you've got the lead time of bringing your product through the supply chain, all the way from China to your consumer in the United States. One of the things that has to be balanced, and we as consumers, I think, need to think about is, are we prepared to pay more for these products, to have them domestically manufactured?
Very good point. Right.
And I think that is.
So it sounds like this debate is very complicated and is likely to go on for a long, long time.
It is.
But the fact remains is that the cost of shipping is really, over the long term, really looking like it's going to be very cost effective.
Absolutely, John. You know, I was lunching with a friend last week who's very involved in the refrigerated part of our business. And if you look all year round, we can eat vegetables and fruit. I remember growing up, we only had strawberries in the summer.
That's a very good point, sure.
Our industry moves thousands of containers of refrigerated fruit and vegetables around the world, from South America, from the growing season, to Europe.
So all around the year, the whole year, where before that was not possible.
Right. So the consumer's going to say, okay, do I just want to eat strawberries in a certain time of the year, or would I like to eat strawberries all year? That comes at a cost. It comes into an environmental cost of moving those strawberries from South America, from a Chile, or...
Right. John, my last question is really aimed at people that maybe are in the earlier point of their careers and maybe looking as to what industry to go into. What would you say to somebody that was actually looking to possibly enter into the shipping industry and have their career there? Why would they want to do something like that?
John, it's an exciting industry. It's one that's always changing. No day is the same as the other. I've been in this industry 35 years, and I genuinely can tell you that there is a different situation every day that we're faced. You get to deal with all types of different customers. You get to deal with different types of consumer items. You learn a lot about companies and how they market themselves to their consumers, how important supply chain is in this area. And again, I think, you know, the fact that our industry is a $400 billion industry, it's not an industry that people coming out of college would necessarily think about coming on in, but it is an exciting industry.
It seems like it's a very good base too, even if they wanted to do something later in life, that they're really learning about the most critical aspects of the business, obviously transportation, and the fact that 90% of world trade goes through shipping, that it's certainly a good place to start.
Exactly, John. It's a good place to come in, and we train our people well, which I think is important. And I can only speak for my industry, but once you join that industry, it gets under your skin and you tend to stay.
Good.
So,
John Kirkland, CEO of ICL, thanks for being a guest on the show today.
You're very welcome, John. A pleasure.